you are somebody who has all sorts of projects going on, and I find that very fascinating. One of them, I could totally be wrong, but I think you're wearing it on your left wrist.
That is correct.
Okay. You co-founded or founded a company called Neosensory.
Exactly.
And I want to ask a bit about what it is and what you're wearing.
Great. Okay, so I got very interested in my lab about 15 years ago. This idea about sensory substitution, which is the idea of, can you push information into the brain via an unusual channel? So remember, the brain is locked in silence and darkness. All it ever sees are electrical spikes coming up data cables. And that's all it has to work with. And yet it constructs everything about, sight and vision and touch and all this stuff. So I got really interested in this question that had been a little thread in the literature since 1890, actually, about, hey, could you take someone, let's say, who is blind and put in visual information, let's say, through the sense of touch? So just as an example, in 1969, there was an experiment where blind people were put in a dental chair, and there was this thing that poked them in the back, a little grid of solenoids. And so whatever the video camera was seeing, they would feel that poked into their back. And blind people got really good at being able to tell, okay, yeah, that's whatever. That's a telephone, that's a face, that's a triangle, just based on what they were feeling in their back. Now, what this demonstrates is, how weird that you come to essentially see with the skin of your back. But what it tells us is that it doesn't matter how the information gets there. There's nothing special about the eyeballs. It just happens that they capture photons, convert those to spikes, and ship that back into the brain. So anyway, there have been various experiments through the years, but it hadn't really been taken up in modern times. So what I did in my lab is build a vest with vibratory motors all over it. And we tested for deafness. For people who are deaf, if the vest captures sound and turns into patterns of vibration on the skin, exactly what your inner ear, your cochlea, is doing. Could a deaf person come to understand the world that way? The answer is yes. So we studied that, we published it. I gave a talk at TED on it. And then immediately afterwards, a bunch of venture capitalists came up and said, we'd like to fund this. And so it was a very sharp turn for me to go from being an academic, or I should say from only being an academic to being, an entrepreneur. But I decided to try that to push this out into the world. And so that's what I've done. That was 10 years ago. And we shrunk the vest down to a wristband, which is indeed what I'm wearing. This wristband has vibratory motors on it. It's got a microphone. It's got full computational capacity. Captures sound, turns into patterns on the skin. And deaf people can come to understand the world, the auditory world around them that way. We have several other things on top of this too. Like, for example, let's say you're not totally deaf, but you just have high frequency hearing loss, which is what happens to people as they get older. So it turns out that we're using cutting edge machine learning here to listen to human speech and just listen for certain high frequency parts of speech called phonemes. And then we buzz in different ways to tell you, oh, I just heard a T, I just heard an S, I heard a V, a B, and so on. And what happens is, for people with high frequency hearing loss, their ear is doing all the work at the low and middle frequencies. They just can't hear the high frequencies anymore. So this just tells them about the high frequency. It just clarifies what's going on out there. And so your brain learns how to combine those two signals. And after a few weeks, people say, oh, I'm just hearing clearly. I don't need hearing aids. I don't need things like that because I can just hear what's going on out there in the world.
I'll say why I'm laughing in a moment. What I'm wondering is whether or not there's enough density of nerves on the wrist. And I was thinking it would be very funny if you had this on your tongue or somewhere or your palm somewhere where there's a lot more nerve endings.
Yeah, great question. Well, it turns out that this is what I learned from stepping one foot in the entrepreneurial world. That's a matter of product market fit. So it turns out putting something like this on the tongue, great idea in terms of nerve density, terrible idea in terms of eating or speaking. So people don't want that. There's all kinds of things you can do on the face. People don't want that. We also were looking into making a glove. People who are deaf don't want to wear a glove around. But a wristband, it turns out, is great. And the answer is your brain doesn't devote that much real estate towards your wrist until it's informationally relevant, like we talked about at the beginning. So what happens is you get better and better. We've published on this data. You get better and better at distinguishing patterns on the wrist because your brain says, whoa, wait, actually, there's really relevant information coming from there. So it gives more real estate to the wrist. In answer to your question, we have 4 motors along here, but what we're using is what's called a haptic illusion, haptic meaning touch. So if I stimulate 2 of those motors next to each other, you will feel a single virtual point in the middle. It'll feel to you like a single point. And as I change the amplitude of those two motors, I can move that point around. And so we're actually stimulating 128 virtual points along the skin there. And as I said, you get better and better at being able to discriminate where the thing is with time.
I would just like to clarify for our listeners that this isn't product placement. You didn't ask me to talk about this. I'm genuinely curious about this thing on your wrist. And the next thing that I'm curious about is you are obviously a hearing individual, unless you've been tricking me this whole time and you're using the wristband. But what I'm wondering is, given that you have access to your ears, this feedback on your wrist is going to be very redundant. So I'm wondering why it is that you're wearing it while we're talking.
I wear it just to show other people, to demonstrate it to other people.
Because, perfect.
Right, because you hit it on the head, which is that if your brain gets a redundant information source, it doesn't care. It doesn't learn on that. So what but for somebody who is deaf, suddenly they realize, wait a minute, this person is speaking. I see the mouth moving, and I'm feeling this buzzing here. And then I see this thing drop, and I see the dog bark, and I see someone knock on the door, and I'm feeling this thing. Their brain learns up on that really fast because it's relevant.